Every single day, roughly 1,000 people move to Florida. Not 1,000 a week, not 1,000 a month. 1,000 people every single day packing up their entire lives, loading moving trucks and heading south. Some are chasing retirement dreams. Some are running from brutal winters. Some are young families who looked at the cost of living in New York or California and said, enough. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. Florida is being transformed at a speed that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. But here's what most people get wrong about Florida's growth. They picture Miami. They picture the beach. They picture South Beach condos and ocean view apartments. And yes, Miami is still growing. But the real story of Florida in 2026 isn't happening in Miami. It's happening in cities you may have never heard of. Cities tucked between highways and orange groves, cities built around canals and lakes, cities that 5 years ago were quiet little towns, and today are some of the fastest growing places in the entire United States. This is the story of 10 of those cities, and some of them are going to surprise you. Subscribe for more deep dives into Florida's fastest changing cities and states. To understand why these cities are exploding, you first have to understand why Florida keeps pulling people in, even as costs rise, even as hurricanes grow stronger, even as longtime residents warn newcomers about what they're walking into. The first reason is the most obvious. Florida has no state income tax, zero. For a family earning $100,000 a year moving from a high-tax state like California or New York, that difference isn't symbolic. It's thousands of dollars back in their pocket every single year. For a business owner, for a remote worker, for a retiree living off investments, the math becomes even more dramatic. That one factor alone has reshaped where wealthy Americans choose to plant their flag. The second reason is the weather. Yes, it's hot. Yes, there are mosquitoes and humidity and summers that feel like walking into a sauna. But for the millions of Americans who spent decades scraping ice off their windshields and dreading February, the trade-off feels more than worth it. Year-round warmth isn't just a comfort. For retirees especially, it's a health decision, a lifestyle decision, and increasingly, a financial one, since warmer climates tend to encourage more active, outdoor-driven lives. The third reason is remote work. The pandemic permanently changed where Americans believe they need to live. If your job exists entirely on a laptop, why pay Manhattan rent? Why stay in San Francisco? Florida offered an answer: lower costs, better weather, no income tax, and in many cases, a genuinely higher quality of life. Younger workers began arriving alongside the retirees, a combination that started reshaping the demographics of Florida's fastest-growing areas almost overnight. And the fourth reason, perhaps the most powerful of all, is simple affordability, relative affordability anyway. Florida's housing prices have risen sharply in recent years. Nobody is pretending otherwise. But compared to coastal California, compared to the New York metro area, compared to Boston or Seattle, Florida still offers something those markets simply cannot: the possibility of actually owning a home with a yard in a safe neighborhood for a price that doesn't require two professional incomes and a decade of savings just to cover the down payment. Put all of that together, and you start to understand why the trucks keep coming. At number 10, we start in South Florida, but not where you'd expect. Doral sits just west of Miami, close enough to the city to feel its energy, far enough away to have built an identity entirely its own. And that identity is business. Doral transformed itself over the past 2 decades into one of the premier international business hubs in all of South Florida, a city where Latin American entrepreneurs, corporate headquarters, logistics companies, and high-end residential developers all converged at the same time. The proximity to Miami International Airport is a major part of the story. For any business that depends on international travel, international shipping, or maintaining close ties with Latin America, there is arguably no better address in Florida than Doral. That geographic advantage attracted companies, and companies attracted workers, and workers attracted restaurants and apartments and luxury developments that continued to make the city more appealing to the next wave of arrivals. The people moving to Doral today tend to be professionals, entrepreneurs, executives. People who want the amenities of Miami without committing to Miami's most chaotic and expensive neighborhoods. They find modern apartment complexes, upscale shopping, and a community that feels cosmopolitan, international, and remarkably well-connected to the broader economy. But Doral is not without its challenges. Housing costs are high by most Florida standards. Traffic is a daily reality for anyone navigating the roads between Doral and Miami proper. And the fast-paced, business-first culture of the city isn't for everyone. For those who want quiet, this is probably not the answer. But for those chasing opportunity, Doral in 2026 remains one of the most strategically positioned cities in the entire state. Move north along the Gulf Coast, away from the intensity of South Florida, and you start to find a very different kind of growth story. Northport sits in Sarasota County, and for years it existed quietly in the shadow of its more famous neighbors, Sarasota to the north, Naples to the south. But sometime in the past few years, people started noticing something. Northport offered waterfront proximity, suburban calm, and housing prices that were dramatically more accessible than nearly anywhere else on the Gulf Coast. For retirees especially, that combination proved almost irresistible. You could buy a home in Northport for a fraction of what the same square footage would cost in Naples. You were still within reasonable distance of some of the most beautiful beaches in Florida, and you got to live in a community that still felt like a neighborhood rather than a tourist destination or a theme park for the wealthy. Families have followed the retirees. The city's infrastructure is expanding to meet the demand. New schools, new roads, new commercial development, filling in the gaps around the residential growth that arrived first. Northport is not glamorous. It doesn't have the name recognition of Miami or the reputation of Naples. What it has is something that may be more valuable in 2026. Space, relative quiet, and a price point that still allows ordinary people to plant roots without financial ruin. On the Gulf Coast, that has become genuinely rare, and Northport knows it. Most people, when they think about Florida's geography, think flat, endless, unbroken pancake flat. And for most of the state, that's accurate, which is exactly why Clermont feels so unusual the first time you see it. Clermont sits in Lake County, west of Orlando, and it has something almost no other Florida city can honestly claim: hills. Actual rolling terrain, lakefront vistas, elevation changes that make the landscape feel more like parts of North Carolina than the Florida most people imagine. It's a small thing, maybe. But it draws a very specific kind of person: the outdoor enthusiast, the cyclist, the triathlete, and it's created a fitness and sporting culture in Clermont that is remarkably distinctive for a mid-sized Florida city. But geography isn't the only thing pulling people here. Clermont's real magnet is its relationship with Orlando. The city sits close enough to Orlando that commuting is feasible, close enough that residents can access the massive job market of the greater Orlando metro. Theme parks, tech companies, healthcare, tourism, logistics, while living somewhere that still feels like it has breathing room. Housing prices, while rising, have remained lower than comparable suburbs on the eastern side of Orlando. The suburban expansion happening in Clermont right now is significant. New communities are filling in rapidly, and the roads connecting Clermont to the broader metro are under constant pressure. Growth brings growing pains. But for people who want access to one of Florida's most dynamic economies while living somewhere that doesn't feel completely swallowed by it, Clermont continues to make a compelling case. Cape Coral is one of the most unusual cities in America, and that unusualness is precisely the point. The city was essentially engineered from scratch, carved out of southwest Florida with hundreds of miles of canals that give an extraordinary number of its residents direct water access from their own backyards. Nowhere else in Florida, and arguably nowhere else in the country, can you find this many homes with private boat docks at this range of price points. For a certain kind of buyer, the boater, the fisherman, the person who has dreamed their entire life of stepping off their back porch and onto a boat, Cape Coral is not just attractive, it's practically mythological. The city's growth has been relentless. New construction continues. Businesses are expanding. Retirees are arriving in steady waves, many of them drawn specifically by that waterfront lifestyle that Cape Coral offers at a price that Fort Lauderdale or Miami would never allow. And yet Cape Coral sits directly in the crosshairs of one of Florida's most serious and growing concerns. Hurricane risk in southwest Florida is not abstract. In 2022, Hurricane Ian made devastating landfall very close to Cape Coral, and the destruction was catastrophic for many residents. Flood insurance costs have risen sharply. Some homeowners found themselves trapped between the home they loved and insurance bills they could no longer afford. These are not small concerns, and Cape Coral's continued growth happens alongside an ongoing, uncomfortable conversation about what it means to build a life in a place that the climate is making increasingly difficult to ensure and increasingly difficult to protect. For now, people are still coming, but the questions are getting harder to ignore. Port St. Lucie is a city that grew so steadily, so consistently, and so quietly that many Floridians were surprised to learn how large it had actually become. Positioned on Florida's Treasure Coast, roughly midway between Miami and Orlando, Port St. Lucie offered a value proposition that proved extremely durable. Everything South Florida has, at a fraction of South Florida's cost and chaos. Lower housing prices, less traffic than Miami or Fort Lauderdale, a suburban atmosphere that felt genuinely family-friendly, and enough new commercial development, new shopping centers, new healthcare facilities, new restaurants to make the city feel like it was actually investing in its future, rather than simply sprawling outward without a plan. Families priced out of Broward and Miami-Dade counties discovered Port St. Lucie and didn't look back. Young couples who wanted space for children found subdivisions that still offered relative affordability. And the steady stream of migrants from the Northeast found that Port St. Lucie's culture, somewhat northern in its pace and expectations, located firmly in the Florida sunshine, felt oddly familiar and immediately comfortable. Port St. Lucie is not the most exciting city on this list. It doesn't have a skyline that photographs dramatically from a helicopter. What it has is functionality, growth, and an increasingly solid infrastructure being built to support a population that is not finished arriving. Wildwood may be the most surprising name on this list, a small city that most Floridians outside of Central Florida would have struggled to place on a map just a few years ago. The explanation for Wildwood's explosion begins, as so many things in Central Florida do, with the Villages. The Villages is the massive, nationally famous retirement community that has expanded steadily through Sumter County, becoming one of the fastest-growing communities in the country in its own right. As the Villages grew, it needed edges. It needed the towns and cities adjacent to it to absorb overflow, both residential overflow and commercial overflow. Wildwood happened to be in exactly the right place, sitting at a strategic highway intersection positioned perfectly to capture residents and businesses that couldn't find space or affordability within the Village's main footprint. Wildwood began growing at a rate that genuinely startled people who had lived in the area for decades. New retail plazas appeared. New residential developments broke ground. New businesses followed the people who followed the retirement migration that had been building for years. Wildwood's population boom is, in many ways, a downstream effect of one of the most significant demographic stories in modern American history, the mass retirement of the baby boom generation, and the city found itself directly in the path of that wave. There is a stretch of Interstate 4 between Tampa and Orlando that has become one of the most economically significant corridors in the American Southeast. And sitting almost exactly in the middle of it is Lakeland. Lakeland's location is not an accident of growth. It's the cause of it. Positioned between Florida's two largest metro areas with direct highway access to both, Lakeland became an obvious choice for logistics companies, warehouse operations, distribution centers, and any business that needed to move goods efficiently across Central Florida. The jobs followed, and the people followed the jobs. But Lakeland isn't only a logistics hub. The city has a genuine downtown, genuine lakefront parks and character, and a local identity that predates the current boom by many decades. What's happening now is layering new economic energy onto a city that already had roots, and the combination is creating something more stable and more textured than the pure suburban expansion happening in some other fast-growing Florida cities. Housing in Lakeland remains notably more affordable than comparable suburbs in either the Tampa or Orlando markets. For a family willing to accept a commute in either direction, or for a worker whose job sits right there in Lakeland's own growing employment base, the value equation is difficult to argue with. The Lakeland Winter Haven metro area has consistently ranked among America's fastest growing in recent years, and that trajectory in 2026 shows no serious signs of reversing. Every booming city eventually reaches a point where its own success starts pricing people out. Orlando reached that point. And when it did, families and young workers began looking at a map, drawing a circle around everything within reasonable commuting distance and landing on St. Cloud. St. Cloud sits just south of Orlando in Osceola County, and its growth over the past decade is almost entirely a story of overflow. As Orlando's housing costs climbed and its neighborhoods filled in, St. Cloud absorbed the families who still wanted access to everything the Orlando metro offered, the jobs, the entertainment, the infrastructure, but could no longer afford to live inside it. Master-planned communities began appearing at a remarkable pace. New schools, new roads, new shopping centers calibrated precisely to the demographics of young families who had arrived with children in tow, and suburban expectations firmly in place. St. Cloud is not trying to become Orlando. It's trying to give the people Orlando priced out somewhere dignified, affordable, and functional to land. Disney World sits close enough that some St. Cloud residents can see the fireworks from their neighborhoods on clear nights. The irony is not lost on anyone. A city growing precisely because of the prosperity generated by a theme park that many of its newest residents can't easily afford to visit. Ocala is a city with a personality that sets it apart from almost every other fast-growing place in Florida. Horse farms stretch across the rolling landscape of Marion County. Springs bubble up through ancient limestone. Forests line roads that still feel unhurried. Ocala looks and feels less like the Florida of beaches and theme parks and more like a quieter, older American landscape. And that has become, against all expectation, one of its most powerful selling points. The people moving to Ocala are often looking for exactly what it offers: room to breathe, lower housing prices, and a pace of life that hasn't been entirely consumed by the machinery of Florida's most intense growth zones. Retirees have been discovering Ocala in growing numbers, drawn by affordability and by the natural beauty of the Ocala National Forest and the famous springs that surround the area. But Ocala is no longer just a retirement story. The city's metro area has become one of the fastest growing in America, full stop, drawing younger residents and families alongside the retirees, expanding its commercial base, and beginning to grapple with the infrastructure demands that rapid growth always brings. There is a version of Ocala's future where the very qualities that attracted people to it are slowly buried under the development they brought with them. It is a tension that every city on this list faces in some form. In Ocala, the stakes feel particularly high because what's at risk is something genuinely irreplaceable, a landscape and a pace of life that Florida is running out of places to protect. And at number 1, the city that may represent Florida's growth story in its purest, most concentrated form. Davenport sits in Polk County, just southwest of the Walt Disney World complex, positioned at a junction of major highways with direct access to both Orlando and Tampa. A decade ago, it was a quiet, largely unremarkable town. Today, it is one of the fastest-growing cities in the state of Florida, and the transformation has been almost shockingly rapid. New housing communities appeared not one at a time, but in clusters. Roads were widened before they were finished being built. National home builders arrived with master-planned subdivisions that seemed to multiply overnight. The combination of affordability, location, and proximity to one of the world's most visited tourist destinations made Davenport an almost logical choice for the wave of people who wanted to live in the orbit of Orlando without paying Orlando prices. Short-term rental communities developed alongside traditional residential ones, adding an unusual economic dimension to Davenport's growth, a layer of vacation homes and investment properties mixed into a city that is simultaneously trying to become a real, functioning community with its own identity. That tension is still being worked out, and the city is still young enough in its current form that the outcome is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is the growth itself. Davenport is building. Davenport is filling in. And if you had driven through it 10 years ago and then drove through it today, you would barely recognize it. Every city on this list is growing. Some of them are growing at rates that feel almost surreal when you look at the numbers, and that growth has brought real opportunity. Jobs, housing, investment, and for many people who moved here, a genuinely better life than the one they left behind. But Florida's boom has a shadow side, and ignoring it would be dishonest. Insurance costs across the state have reached levels that are forcing some residents to make impossible choices. Homeowners in flood-prone and hurricane-exposed areas are watching their annual insurance bills climb by thousands of dollars, in some cases doubling or tripling within just a few years. For retirees on fixed incomes or for families who bought at the edge of their budget, those increases aren't an inconvenience. They're a crisis. Some people who move to Florida with every intention of staying are leaving, not because they stopped loving the weather or the lifestyle, but because the financial math stopped working. Traffic congestion in Florida's fastest-growing corridors has become severe. Infrastructure that was built for smaller populations is struggling under the weight of the growth happening all around it. Roads are widened and filled again almost immediately. Water systems, power grids, and school systems are under constant pressure. Longtime Floridians, people who were born here, who grew up here, who built their lives in cities that looked nothing like what they look like today, are watching the state change in ways that feel deeply uncomfortable. The affordability that made Florida attractive to newcomers is being slowly eroded by the very arrival of those newcomers. The quiet neighborhoods and open spaces that defined the state for decades are shrinking, being replaced by subdivisions and strip malls and four-lane roads leading to the next subdivisions. This is not a new story. It is the oldest story in American development. Growth changes places. That is what growth does. The question Florida is now wrestling with and struggling to answer is whether the changes happening at this speed and this scale can be managed in a way that preserves something worth preserving. Florida in 2026 is not one place. It is dozens of places, each one growing in its own direction, each one attracting its own mix of people, each one trying to figure out what it wants to become under the pressure of relentless, unslowing, sometimes overwhelming change. The cities on this list, from Doral to Davenport, from Ocala to Northport, are all chapters in the same story. A story about where Americans choose to go when they decide to start over. A story about what they find when they get there. And a story about what happens to a place when too many people fall in love with it at the same time. Florida is still drawing people in, the trucks are still coming, the cranes are still turning. And the question, how long can this growth continue, and what will it cost by the time it slows, remains for now unanswered. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the cities, states, and trends reshaping the country. And tell us in the comments, which Florida city would you actually move to? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.